Hello, good evening. Welcome to Novara Live. My name's Bastani. Tonight I have the immeasurable pleasure of being joined by Moya, Lothian-McLean. Moya, how are we?
I think it is actually quite measurable. There's probably some sort of Richter scale about the pleasures of being joined by me. But I'm well. I'm well enough, Aaron.
It's possibly measurable, but uh, perhaps the the metric we're using, perhaps it's obsolete. We do have some interesting stories coming up tonight. One particularly tough one. 12 people have died in the English Channel after a boat capsized carrying asylum seekers. X, formerly known as Twitter, has been banned in Brazil, and a report by the Trussell Trust has found shocking results on food poverty in Britain. So stay tuned for all of that. Foreign Secretary David Lammy yesterday announced a very partial ban on just some weapons exports to Israel. The decision affects less than 10% of the UK's export licenses to Israel involving arms components. And Israel will still continue to receive the vast majority of its arms from the United States and Germany. But while the ban has very little material impact on Israel, it is creating diplomatic waves. This was the response from the office of Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. Days after Hamas executed 6 Israeli hostages, the UK government suspended 30 arms licenses to Israel. This shameful decision will not change Israel's determination to defeat Hamas, a genocidal terrorist organisation that savagely murdered 1,200 people on October 7th, including 14 British citizens. Just as Britain's heroic stand against the Nazis is seen today as having been vital in defending our common civilization, so too will history judge Israel's stand against Hamas and Iran's axis of terror. With or without British arms, Israel will win this war and secure our common future. Despite the ban, Israel will still receive British-made parts for the lethal F-35 fighter jets being used to bomb civilians in Gaza, and that's because David Lammy's arms ban doesn't cover the export of those parts to the global supply chain, meaning Israel can still get them directly from Lockheed Martin or any other of the more than 1,600 suppliers in the manufacturing chain. The message that the ban has sent to Washington is also very, very interesting. ITV's Robert Peston reports this. Washington sources tell me the White House feels let down by Starmer's and Lammy's decision to revoke licenses for the export of military equipment to Israel. They assured us they wouldn't do this, said one. Not the first time Keir Starmer's not been entirely honest, if that is correct. It's not clear how you can assure a foreign state that you won't impose an arms ban when that decision has to be based on legal advice about possible breaches of humanitarian law, however. And it looks like the UK government did the bare minimum to comply with the advice it received. In an interview on BBC Breakfast, Defence Secretary John Healey assured the audience that nothing really had changed in respect to Israel.
We are a staunch ally of Israel. We remain a staunch ally of Israel. We've made this legal judgment as a result of the process we're required to follow. We've suspended the export licenses on 30 out of 350 parts. These are ones that could be a clear risk in breaching international law in Gaza, but our determination to stand with Israel, to be part of the collective defense if they come under direct attack again, as they have done before, remains resolute and absolute.
You know, if the UK does comply with ICJ arrest warrants of Benjamin Netanyahu and Yoav Gallant, that's quite significant. The idea that we are unapologetic allies to Israel like nobody else, but we will allow the Prime Minister to be arrested if there's an arrest warrant, that doesn't quite add up. There's clearly been a shift. Under Labour, and I don't really feel like they're being honest about it. The government has also come under fire from Conservatives for following British law. Tory leadership contender Robert Jenrick has said this. This is shameful gesture politics to appease the hard left. Sir Keir has put party management first and Britain's interests second. Britain should be standing with our ally Israel as it defends itself and the world against Iran's war of state-sponsored terrorism. I'm sure Tehran loves to hear how important it is. That is someone hoping to be Prime Minister one day, criticising a government for following, get this, its own legal advice when it comes to arms exports. Tory MP Tom Tugendhat launched his own leadership campaign today. Here's what he said about the partial ban.
On the day that the Israeli government discovered the bodies of more hostages, on the day that they had to share that news of grief and torment with families, on the very day that we saw the real price of Hamas and the evil extremist violence that they brought not just to Israel, but also to the Palestinian people, on that day, the British government decided that it was the right day to stand against Israel's right to defend itself. I mean, that's a remarkable decision. And it will be a decision that has been heard not just in Washington and Tel Aviv, but around the world. Because if we're not willing to stand by our allies when they are literally discovering the bodies of their murdered citizens, what is the point of an alliance?
To be clear, Tugendhat is wrong on the facts. The bodies of the hostages were discovered over the weekend, not on Monday, when the partial ban was announced. But he does raise the issue of timing, with the ban announced on the day that Israel was burying those dead hostages. On that topic, Priti Patel, who's also standing for the Tory leadership, said this: Starmer's decision is appalling. To play politics with Israel's security on a day they bury their dead is as saddening as it is disgraceful. This decision is purely for the purposes of internal Labour politics and is a total capitulation to his hard-left Labour MPs. It's clear that the Prime Minister doesn't have the courage to stand up to our enemies, whether that's Putin or Hamas. Just like on the deportation of foreign offenders, Sakir is more afraid by the militant left-wingers in his own party than those who pose a direct threat to our national security. This shocking betrayal of a key UK ally is a terrible indication of the UK's approach to national security under this weak Prime Minister. Now, it wasn't just Tory politicians criticising the government. Labour Friends of Israel posted this statement. Since 7th of October, Israel has come under repeated, unprovoked and indiscriminate attack by Iran and its proxies Hamas, Hezbollah and the Houthis. We do not believe that restrictions on UK arms sales will help bring the tragic conflict in Gaza. It's always tragic, isn't it? It's tragic. The tragedy, nobody can do anything about it. That's why we need to keep selling them arms. The tragic conflict in Gaza to a close or help ensure the release of the hostages, 6 of whom Hamas brutally murdered just days ago. Moreover, we're deeply concerned by the signal this sends to Iran, the world's leading sponsor of state terrorism, and Vladimir Putin's closest ally in Ukraine. We fear, therefore, that these restrictions risk encouraging Israel's enemies, leading to greater escalation rather than de-escalation. Labour MP Emily Thornberry was asked about both the timing of the decision and Labour Friends of Israel's comments on the World Tonight.
What about the timing of this? That is where quite a significant amount of the criticism from Israel and from others has come on the day that 6 hostages who were killed by Hamas are being buried. Is this really an appropriate time to make this kind of statement, which has been taken very badly in Israel?
Yeah, I think that's unfortunate. But I suspect...
A mistake?
I suspect that what was wanted was that they, once they'd got the legal advice, they wanted to come in and tell Parliament about it straight away. But yeah, I think that it was unfortunate that it was today, given all the funerals. I
mean, some of your own colleagues, now you have been a member of Labour Friends of Israel. Are you still a member? I mean, you've seen the statement they put out. We are deeply concerned by the signal this sends to Iran. We fear, therefore, that these restrictions risk encouraging Israel's enemies, leading to greater escalation rather than de-escalation.
Well, I don't agree with that. I think that what's most important is that we abide by international law. And we should not be selling arms to a country that might use them for internal repression or for external aggression. And that's the law. That's what we should be doing. And those weapons or those parts will no longer be sold.
I mean, actually, the end of that, what she said there is obviously positive. And you can say something's unfortunate. I mean, it's unfortunate that people have been killed. Obviously, that's unfortunate. You'd rather those people not be dead, obviously. But this emphasis on the timing, there is a war right now with tens of thousands of people, maybe 100,000 people plus having died in Gaza. When is a good time? When is a good time? And this idea about, we need to de-escalate the situation with Iran. How is Israel trying to de-escalate the situation with Iran? Is it by killing military officers in Syria? Is it by hitting diplomatic buildings again in Syria? What is it? Is it by an assassination of a Palestinian politician in Iran. I mean, are these efforts to de-escalate things? Actually, when you think about it, Iran's been remarkably restrained, particularly since that massive attack it launched on Israel. Since then, there have been multiple instances of Israel attacking Iran, and there doesn't seem to have been a response. And yet, they're still being labeled the aggressors. Criticism of the ban also came from some parts of the Jewish community, with Chief Rabbi Ephraim Mervis saying this. It beggars belief that the British government, a close strategic ally of Israel, has announced a partial suspension of arms licenses at a time when Israel is fighting a war for its very survival on 7 fronts, forced upon it on the 7th of October, and at the very moment when 6 hostages murdered in cold blood by cruel terrorists were being buried by their families. As Israel faces down the threat of Iran and its proxies, not just to its own people, but to all of us in the democratic West. Israel's an apartheid state. I don't think it's in the democratic West, but there we are. This announcement feeds the falsehood that Israel is in breach of international humanitarian law, when in fact it is going to extraordinary lengths to uphold it. Sadly, this announcement will serve to encourage our shared enemies like decapitated toddlers. It will not help to secure the release of the remaining 101 hostages, nor contribute to the peaceful future we wish and pray for all people in the region and beyond. Britain and Israel have so much to gain by standing together against our common enemies, for the sake of a safer world. Surely that must be the way forward. I just find it absolutely extraordinary that this man has said that, and we'll come to some of the responses to what he said in a moment. But in my opinion, you should not have senior religious figures inserting themselves in political debates, democratic political debates, as regularly as Ephraim Mervis does. He's got a taste for this now, right? And I say that with regards to the Archbishop of Canterbury. I'd say it about anyone. Imagine if there's a Catholic bishop and they started attacking a political party every week because of their position on abortion. We would say, look, we criticize the UK for a bunch of things. One of the things it's very good at is the division of politics from religion. It's very good at that. Okay, let's not go down that road. It doesn't end very well. Quickly, on the 7 fronts that were referenced by Netanyahu, I'm apparently told it's Iran, Syria, Lebanon, Yemen, Iraq, the West Bank, and Gaza. Although, of course, the West Bank and Gaza are technically internal territories for Israel. Would you call those fronts? Would you call some of those places, they're not bordering Israel, fronts? Very, very strange. Anyway, the idea seems to be that allies should remain allies no matter what they do. And when they're using weapons to kill Palestinian kids in huge numbers or blowing up vital civilian infrastructure, you shouldn't ask questions or examine the legality of their actions. No, you should shut up and keep arming them. But fortunately, not all Jewish Brits agreed with the chief rabbi's statement. This was executive editor of the Financial Times, Robert Shrimsley. The chief rabbi, an absurd post in itself given the structure of UK synagogues, should ration his interventions in British politics. Fears of British Jews at home are a reasonable topic. Arms licenses and foreign policy, not so much. Well said. The idea, by the way, of a religious minority or any religious figure trying to shape foreign policy like that, when UK armed forces aren't involved, like if Britain was invading a country like Iraq in 2003 and a rabbi or a priest wants to say this is not a good idea, of course. But the idea that you would comment on overseas disputes like this and try and inflect UK foreign policy preferences in such a way is just extraordinary. It's extraordinary. AIPAC does it in the US. We do not want that here in the UK. Henry Mance is a Jewish journalist also at the Financial Times. He had this analysis of the chief rabbi's statement. Disappointing and extreme statement by the chief rabbi. 40,000 Palestinians have been killed at least. Children are catching polio. A UN court has found Israel in breach of international law. Illegal settlers are seizing West Bank land. You can support Israel, but it is deeply sad that for a faith leader, none of this merits a mention. Also not mentioned, there is a deal on the table that would save the lives of the remaining hostages, but Netanyahu won't take it, despite the advice of his security chiefs. Well said. Moya, I've got a few questions for you, but the first one is something we touched upon a little bit yesterday. This is a bit of a Labour fudge, isn't it? Because those critical of Israel don't think that enough is being done. And then, of course, we see the reaction today where supporters of Israel, say this is outrageous, outlandish. Keir Starmer has burnt his bridges with a valuable ally. Do you agree with that nobody's pleased it's a fudge? Or do you think this is a good step in the right direction by Labour?
I mean, the way we're framing Labour here is that Labour is the 2024 version of the BBC, in that they do not please anyone with their middle of the road decisions. I think, again, it's nuanced. It's nowhere near enough for someone like me or you or anyone who wants to see the genocide in Gaza immediately ended. However, this is a clear break with conservative policy and wider policy driven by the US when it comes to Israel. They are stopping some exports licenses. I think it's only 8%, but that is still such a massive shift from what the Conservatives were doing, which was literally about to defend the right of the government to export licenses. So actually, is that even correct? Sorry, I don't want to spread misinformation. But the Conservatives were 10 toes down, saying that we're not going to stop exporting components to Israel. We're not going to stop any of this trade whatsoever. Don't even ask us about it. Whereas Labour, within the first few months of government, has said, well, we are going to suspend some exports. Again, nowhere near enough. But it is emblematic of this iteration of Labour, in that they will make some reforming, some tinkering around the edges positions, some positions where they will move slightly towards a more progressive stance, but they're never going to commit wholesale, because, and then in that way, they're never going to please anyone. They're never going to satisfy the people who rightly think that a genocide should be stopped, and that Britain has absolutely no reason under international humanitarian law to be exporting any sort of weapons components to Israel. And they're also now, by doing any action whatsoever, have pissed off every person or every institution that is, fully backing what is going on in Gaza. What's interesting is we're nearly, 12 months into this war. This is a government shift means that this is the first sort of tangible movement I think we've seen from our state to show any sort of opposition to what is happening in Israel and in Gaza and in wider Palestine. But are they going to stop everything else? Jeremy Corbyn posed a question in Parliament yesterday where he was asking, are you going to, become more transparent about the use of the RAF base in Cyprus? A surveillance plane still going to be flying from there? A weapon still going to be sent out from there? If you're stopping these exports, but is the base still going to be used? And the US uses that base as well. And then there's the third thing I think you touched upon, which is it shows the fiddly nature of the entire global arms industry, right? Because Britain is stopping some arms exports, but that doesn't mean that, say, components for the F-35s, those devastating jets that are made in Britain, won't be reaching Israel because of the way that third-party private arms company works. They can easily just go through them, and it's this really intricate trade that means that, okay, we're directly not exporting, but is that being followed through every single global supply chain? I probably think not.
It's such an interesting one because I agree with you. I think it's obviously a great step. It's a great step in the right direction. Obviously, UNRWA, Tories wouldn't have done it. The ICJ stuff, Tories wouldn't have done it. This is all really positive. But I think if there's a general election tomorrow, I think Wes Streeting and Jess Phillips they still lose their seats, and people like Ephraim Mervis probably isn't saying vote for the Labour Party. So yeah, it can be both a positive step in the right direction, but politically, there's no real upside for Labour in what's happening here. At least 12 people have died in the English Channel after a small boat carrying asylum seekers capsized. The disaster is the single worst loss of life in the Channel this year. The boat is thought to have had dozens of people on board when it got into trouble off the French coast, after the bottom of the boat ripped open. The French Coast Guard has said more than 50 people have been rescued, with boats and helicopters searching for survivors. Those in need of emergency treatment have been transferred to a temporary medical facility on the French coast. At least 30 migrants have died or gone missing while trying to cross the Channel this year. And in the past 7 days, over 2,000 people have attempted to make the highly perilous crossing to the UK. Home Secretary Yvette Cooper described the incident in the Channel as horrifying and deeply tragic. And Moya, that number of 2,000 people in 7 days is really something, isn't it?
When you compare the coverage of deaths of migrants as well in the Channel compared to, say, the loss of billionaires at sea, I think it's a point that we've made, but it's worth hammering home. Everyone who's lost in the submarine that went down or the yacht that recently capsized, there was an investigation going on into the yacht off Sicily where I think 6 people died, including a British billionaire and his daughter. People are being investigated for potential manslaughter. There's no suggestion of any, foul play or whatever at this point, but still the need to find someone responsible for the deaths of these people is such that there is an investigation launched immediately by the Italian authorities for manslaughter. Because if you are a wealthy person, inherently your life has more value than somebody who is on a dinghy crossing the English Channel trying to get to safety. And therefore, someone must be held accountable for the loss of your life. And yet we can use 65 people at sea and just everyone will hold their hands up. Yvette Cooper, the French Borders Control, Frontex will all go, it's such a tragedy. Now we have to stop these gangs. There's no individual, investigation into where was the Coast Guard, what was happening, were any distress calls received. There's been lots of different sort of independent media investigations over the years, which has shown there have been multiple chances often in these cases, and I can't say for this one, but previous ones, where, the lives of these people, these individuals have been, there's been potential to save them. There has been distress calls made. There's been, Coast Guard boats that have been very near to the site where sinkings have gone down, but they haven't been saved. And the question remains why, because I bet you if there were a bunch of billionaires crammed onto these boats, obviously would never happen, but if there were a bunch of billionaires making a distress call, every Coast Guard, doesn't matter which side of the channel they are, would be making an effort to find them as soon as those calls went out. But here, no, you can lose 65 people in one go, and it's just a headline.
Today's tragedy once again highlights the issue of small boat crossings and migration to the UK. It's an issue that has dominated Conservative discourse, and it continues to be prominent in the current Tory party leadership contest. Launching his campaign yesterday, James cleverly told journalists how he would deal with small boat crossings.
We need to control legal migration. And when I was Home Secretary, I did. Under my leadership, Home Office applications fell. The backlog was cleared. The grant rate came down. Deportations increased. I didn't talk tough, I took action. And when we deal with illegal migration, I stand by what I have always said. We need to have a deterrent. And as leader, as Prime Minister, I will use my contacts and my reputation with Rwanda to resurrect that incredibly important partnership.
Just to recap on that incredibly important partnership, the deportation scheme was ruled unlawful by the Supreme Court on the grounds that Rwanda was not a safe country. By the way, it's an authoritarian regime, according to the Economist Democracy Index. And after the Tory government passed a bill simply declaring the country safe, as if that's magic, despite no changes to the material reality, legal experts declared that the courts would probably continue to halt flights. According to current Home Secretary Yvette Cooper, all that cost a total of £700 million, with nearly 300 million paid to Rwanda. By the way, some of those houses, some of that accommodation has since been sold to Rwandans. In the meantime, the Tories simply stopped making asylum decisions, creating a potential bill for housing asylum seekers in this country up to £40 billion over the next 4 years. So you've got £700 million, £40 billion. Imagine wanting to resurrect that. But it's not just what the Tories call illegal migration that they want to tackle. Perfectly legal migration is coming under scrutiny too. This was Tory MP Tom Tugendhat during his leadership launch today.
Now, I will be serious about leadership. I will connect policies and recognise complexity. But to drive change, we do need clear targets. Otherwise, there's always going to be another excuse. So under my leadership, the maximum level of non-British net migration will be capped at 100,000 people a year. That will allow businesses to start planning for a different kind of economy and make sure that everyone understands long in advance long in advance, too long in advance, that the public sector cannot depend on other people's children to step in for our own.
Other people's children to step in for our own. Okay. Interesting way of phrasing it. Now, you might have heard that figure before. 100,000 people, no more. Can you imagine being 100,001? Sorry, try next year. Well, that's because it's the figure Tory leaders have been trumpeting for years. David Cameron started the trend in 2010, pledging to bring net migration down from 200,000 to just the tens of thousands. So 99,999 is, of course, the tens of thousands. Theresa May stuck with that pledge, rounding it up to 100,000. Brave her. In 2019, now Reform leader Nigel Farage called for the net migration cap to be tightened to 50,000 people per year. But in 2020, Boris Johnson bucked the trend, lowering the wage threshold for immigration to the UK and promoting its benefits for the economy. By earlier this year, Rishi Sunak was vowing to reintroduce the cap just a month before the Tories were annihilated at the polls. That history shows how the immigration cap is the definition, the quintessence of a political football. All these numbers all just seem incredibly arbitrary. What if loads of people leave one year, but then barely anyone leaves the year after? Are we still talking 100,000? What if, for some reason, we need lots more care workers in the economy or lots more construction workers in the economy? We need 4 or 5 million new homes in the UK. Who's going to build them? Moya, Tom Tugendhat's cap of 100,000. What do you make of it?
Half of the Conservative membership, which is very small, I think it's like 85,000 at this point, would support a freeze on all migration over the next 5 years. So, and in that same speech, when he's launching his campaign, I find Tom Tugendhat a very tragic figure. He also decided he would do some pandering to the hard Tory right beyond migration by saying that he was prepared to leave parts of the ECHR if they didn't allow them to deport foreign criminals. Time and time again to see more Conservative leadership hopefuls and Conservative leaders pledging we're going to cap migration without any consideration of reforming the migration system to maybe, if you allowed these safer routes, if you allowed, or reforming infrastructure and skills in the country in the first place, then maybe so many people, we wouldn't need to keep the entirety of the country afloat. But I'm always in favour of, a much more porous border system, a system where people can come and go as they please personally, freedom of movement. I remember that. I remember the promise of freedom of movement. But Tom Tugendhat is just trying to play to an increasingly vanishingly small base who have got more ossified in their views and more rigid about these things that you have to say in order to get elected. It doesn't matter that they don't work. They're almost like rituals, like mantras. You have to repeat the special 5 mantras, and then the ghost of Margaret Thatcher appears in your mirror and anoints you the new Tory leader. But you have to say the 5 things, and one of those things is we're going to cap migration, and I promise it will work this time, Gov.
Look, they've been saying this for 14 years. They started with David Cameron. They keep not delivering it because it's not plausible. Now, does Britain need 1.3 million net immigration like it did over 2 years under Priti Patel? Does it need that to carry on as an economy? No. But you need a lot more than 100,000 people if you want to have an NHS, if you want to have elderly care, if you want to actually build anything, because we're an ageing society with moderately low fertility rates. We are. And also, by the way, lots of people leave every year. Brits quite like going to work in places like Dubai, Qatar, the US, Australia, etc. So this is not serious. This is not serious politics. And also, isn't it interesting at the same time that the Tories talk about all this stuff? Our own children should replace other people's children. Well, it's really expensive to have kids, guys. I don't know if you've noticed. X, formerly known as Twitter, has now been banned in Brazil. No more tweets from Elon for you. Last Wednesday, Supreme Court Justice Alexandra de Moraes gave the company a day to name a new legal representative in the country, or it would be shut down. The next day, X announced that it would soon no longer be available to users in Brazil, quote, simply because we would not comply with his, de Moraes, illegal orders to censor his political opponents, even though he's a judge. X also said that after its legal representative resigned, de Moraes froze her bank accounts. They quoted this: our challenges against his manifestly illegal actions were either dismissed or ignored. De Moraes himself has spearheaded a judicial crackdown against online disinformation. He's done that for years. But he's also something of a controversial figure who divides public opinion. For some, he helped save democracy in the face of attacks on the reliability of the country's voting system by former President Jair Bolsonaro in 2022. However, followers of Bolsonaro allege that de Moraes curbed freedom of expression and unfairly targeted them. Elon Musk, ex-CEO, made his own unique contribution to the situation by mocking de Moraes online. Among many, many tweets from Musk, this from last Friday stands out. Alexandre de Moraes is an evil dictator cosplaying as a judge. He's not a politician. To be clear, he is a judge. And then there's this from last Wednesday when Mr. Musk shared a picture of the judge behind bars with the image appearing to have been made by X's generative AI, Grok. One day, Alexandre, this picture of you in prison will be real. Now mark my words. Insane. The world's wealthiest person making these kinds of threats to a judge. Randolph Rodriguez, a senator and the government's leader in Congress, responded to Musk saying this: "The rule is clear. If all Brazilians and all companies based in Brazil have to comply with the law, why shouldn't Musk?" Seems like a fair, sensible point to me. Separately on Thursday, Starlink, which is Musk's satellite network, posted that it had received an order from de Moraes earlier in the week, freezing its finances and blocking it from conducting financial transactions in Brazil. That is apparently part of broader efforts to collect fines levied on X for failing to comply with court orders. This whole row began in April with de Moraes ordering the suspension of dozens of X accounts for allegedly spreading disinformation. X failed to really respond adequately, and it escalated from there. In a slightly related story, there have been developments with messaging app Telegram, and this does relate to X, bear with me. The company's CEO, Pavel Durov, was arrested in late August after he landed in France on a private jet. You probably knew that already. The warrant for that arrest was issued by the French Judicial Police as part of a preliminary investigation into 12 possible offences. Now, last Wednesday, Durov was presented before a prosecutor, and that was relating to 6 of those possible 12 offences. He's now been released on bail, although he's barred from leaving France until the case is resolved. The Russian-born CEO has massive ambitions for Telegram, and as recently as March, he told the Financial Times that he was pushing forward with IPO plans. That was after rejecting approaches from potential investors who he said gave the Dubai-based company valuations of $30 billion plus. Apparently, Durov wanted that IPO to happen before the middle of 2026, but with his arrest in France, that was already very unlikely. But now he has another problem, because a second country, South Korea, has now launched its own probe into Telegram. The Times reports this. The South Korean police are investigating the messaging app Telegram on suspicion of enabling an epidemic of pornographic deepfakes in which thousands of women had their faces incorporated into obscene images. The investigation parallels one in France, where the Russian-born founder of Telegram, Pavel Durov, has been arrested on suspicion of failing to prevent the criminal use of the social media platform, which connects large numbers of users in closed online groups in which digital content can be shared. The French investigation focuses on the publication of child abuse images, the selling of illegal drugs, gang fraud, and money laundering. In South Korea, the greatest concern is about pornographic deepfakes, which use AI to create convincing video as well as still images. Like their French counterparts, with whom they say they are cooperating, South Korean investigators complain that Telegram has not cooperated with its requests to provide data to enable it to investigate the criminal use of its channels. As France has done, the Seoul Metropolitan Police Agency launched an internal investigation into the corporate entity of Telegram before officially charging it. Woo Jong-soo, head of the National Office of Investigation, said. Telegram does not readily provide investigation data, such as account information, to us or other state investigative bodies, including those in the US. This is really extraordinary. In response, a spokesperson for Telegram told The Times this. Telegram actively monitors harmful content on its platform, including illegal pornography. Moderators proactively monitor public parts of the platform public parts of the platform, use AI tools and accept user reports in order to remove content that breaches Telegram's terms of service. Now, this all comes at a time when South Korea is experiencing a rising epidemic of pornographic deep fakes. So far this year, 781 victims of deepfake crime have made reports to the country's Advocacy Center for Online Sexual Abuse Victims. That compares to just 69 for the whole of 2018. Most sickening of all is that more than a third of those reports involve children. Good luck with an IPO when you won't share data concerning people making deepfake child pornography. Utterly disgusting. In any case, between these two stories, X in Brazil and Telegram in France and now South Korea, it does feel like a major vibe shift is underway. The sovereign states are now standing up to tech platforms in a manner that was unthinkable even a couple of years ago. And really interesting for me was the overt admission by the South Koreans that they're working alongside the French and that the US is also aware of things going on. My guess is that other countries will also become involved with relation to Durov and Telegram. Moya, this is going to sound tangential. It's not. Bear with me. I want your thoughts on this, on Telegram, on X, on nation states standing up to them. But I also want your thoughts on a separate story, which is connected, which is Tinder seeing the number of its paying subscribers falling for the 7th consecutive quarter. And I think in a weird way, these both speak to, like I say, a vibe shift. For basically 15 years, states haven't stood up to digital media companies. And for 15 years or longer, people have genuinely or generally thought, not always, but most of the time, have generally thought that digital technologies, mobile phones, make their lives better, not worse. I think that's kind of changed. So what do you make of that vibe shift? You know, you're a lot younger than me, so I think you're a pretty better place to comment on it.
I think there has been a vibe shift, as you put it. I mean, it's the classic thing, isn't it? It's when they were building all the motorways in 50s, 60s, planning this brand new modernist world that would be driven by cars. It was only halfway through the projects that everyone went, hang on, the cities look disgusting and this actually might not be the best idea in the world. And so then you had this half-built world of motorways, some finished, some not. That's why Glasgow's the way it is, why the M25 is the way it is. But there was a big pushback in the middle of it. It wasn't at the start. People didn't have the vision to see that this new technology actually maybe shouldn't be integrated into every facet of the life and that the old should be burned down to replace it. The old should be burned down, it should replace it. It was only midway through when they could see some of the outcomes that they went, oh dear, maybe this actually wasn't really good for our general well-being and the way that we construct society. I do think with the Tinder thing, you have identified there's a vibe shift. Tinder, however, is part of it and isn't, because Tinder is part of Match Group, and Match Group is the biggest dating conglomerate in the world. They own, things like OkCupid and Hinge, and Tinder is losing followers, but dating in general, app dating, is actually up. There's all these articles about how app dating is over, and it isn't. For example, in the US, I think the users of dating apps went up by 6% from 2022 to 2024. What has shifted is something like Tinder, which used to be the dominant app, is losing subscribers and they are choosing new apps because that's the way things work. People still believe that apps are part of a portfolio in the way they'll meet people or that they will make their lives better. They just have burned out old apps. So something like Tinder or things like Twitter, whatever, not just for dating I'm talking about here, but in general, people realize that maybe, behavioral addiction to my smartphone and these apps as part of that and the pattern of behavior of disconnection that comes through these apps isn't making my life better. But there's not quite the framework there to break away from app usage altogether because everyone's on apps. So instead you just migrate to a new app. And that's what's happened with dating apps and Tinder. It's not that people are using dating apps less per se. They have a lot less they have a more inconsistent relationship with them. So you'll download an app, then you'll delete an app, then you'll re-download an app, then you'll delete an app. You might pay for an app for a bit, then stop paying for it, then pay for it again when you've forgotten how boring the usage of it is. It's more than awareness that these apps haven't transformed their lives in the ways they thought they would. They thought that these would be like, we'd be living in that utopia by now, everything's silver and the cars are flying, but instead it's like, well, this guy won't text me back for the 16th time and I can't actually bag a date, even though I've got hundreds of thousands of people at a swipe of a finger. So Tinder's linked, and I think, yes, there's the dating, not dating app, the general vibe shift, the digital vibe shift is part of it, but people are not just boycotting these platforms yet. They're still trapped in these relationships with them where they feel they can't exist without them, and they've been integrated fully into their lives, same way with something like a motorway and the cars, but they are aware that perhaps they haven't improved their lives in the fashion that they thought they would. When it comes to sovereign states, I think that that's kind of the same story, but just on a much bigger multi-international level, like multi-international. And in that, states have realized they've handed massive amounts of power to these private corporations who now control where people talk, they control their data, they control what people are being shown. And these states, it's actually affecting the politics, that drive these states. I bet I would be interested to know what political faction in South Korea is driving it, because I know recently that there was an election which the right-wing faction lost, even though the president's still in place. So I'd feel like it's probably the more progressive party that's back in power driving it. If I'm wrong, I'm so sorry. This is just gleaned from my South Korean news listening every morning. And in France, we know very, very obviously that Macron and co are running scared from the far right. And it's fascinating to me to see that there's this crackdown now on the platforms where people have been, it's done through the prism of, say, like, deepfake's great. I believe that we should be cracking down on showing things like child abuse and deepfake porn. But I think there is another motive there by these states, which is they realize that this is a place where there are threats to the established order of things, the established political order of things. And that often congregates on these platforms that they are specifically targeting at this time. That Telegram is a massive channel for, like, the far right. That's somewhere where these people are gathering and organizing. So it's definitely that the power, the way of things is being threatened. And only now is action starting to be taken against these massively powerful CEOs. And in Brazil, again, like Elon Musk. Twitter, same thing. It's a progressive government in charge, or normally progressive government, and the Supreme Court's cracking down on misinformation. Twitter has become a far-right cesspit owned by supposedly the richest man in the world. You know how I feel about that label applied to Elon Musk. His billionaire status is smoke and mirrors. It's all speculation funded by government contracts. He's not really a billionaire. He's a state-sponsored phony. I hate it. But yeah, there's this ulterior motive there. Like, we want to take some power back. But again, like the motorways, like the property developers we allowed to colonize huge tracts of land. It's too late to put the genie back in the bottle. And maybe burning it down and starting again would actually be more proactive in the long run, but who knows?
Yeah, it's a really fascinating analogy. I hadn't thought of the roads one in so much as I had thought of it, but the idea that, well, the infrastructure's there, you have the car, you're going to use it, even if you think actually it has massive downsides 20 or 30 years later. We can look at this stuff now 20, 25 years after it all kicks in at the start of the 21st century. Some things are really good, right? I think the idea that you can access movies and music online, streaming services, I think people think that's a net good. You can access far more music than you ever could building the world's biggest record collection. Fine. A sound old record collection. I think people like that. Online banking, I think people generally think that's really, really good. But I do think there are major questions being asked about, like you say, Moya, how much culture and discourse do we outsource really to online spaces? The dating thing fascinates me because there was this development by Tinder, like you say, which is kind of on its way out as the brand leader, the market leader rather. They're going to introduce AI wingmen, and the AI wingman would advise you, the user, on what photos to use. So it will go through your photos, telling you what photos you should pick. It will tell you how to write the bio. It will tell you, what questions to ask people, how to answer. And I'm like, this is insane. You're talking to somebody you've never met, saying things which aren't actually things you've come up with, using pictures you've not chosen. It really does feel rather dystopian. But I'm 40 years old. Maybe I'm going to think that about everything as I get older. But it does feel very, very odd to me. It does feel very, very odd. Maybe the killer app for Gen Alpha is just going to be hanging out offline. I hope so. There's a deluge of evidence showing that rises in relative poverty and things like food bank use have been tied to changes in welfare provision over the last 14 years. As welfare has been reformed, use of food banks have grown. And, critically, most of those in receipt of such benefits are in households where someone works. In fact, if you're in poverty in the UK, you are more likely to be in a household which has someone working than not. Now, the Trussell Trust, which is the largest provider of food parcels in the UK, has published a survey, and its conclusions are alarming. Nearly half of working families who claim universal credit have run out of food in the last month. Extraordinary. It also shows they are struggling to keep up with bills, with 2/3 borrowing money to stay afloat, and 2/5 saying they expect their ability to afford day-to-day basics to deteriorate over the autumn. Anti-poverty campaigners say two things should be done to alleviate this in the short term. The first is to increase the rate of universal credit. The second is to abolish the 2-child limit. Right now, the universal credit payment is capped to 2 children. Any more kids than that, and I'm afraid you're on your own. Tough. Those are both measures which Labour have ruled out. Indeed, the party leadership went as far as removing the whip from 6 MPs who voted with an SNP amendment last month to scrap the 2-child benefit cap. Rochelle Earwaker from the Joseph Rowntree Foundation told the Guardian newspaper it was painfully clear that millions routinely can't make it through the month without turning to help or going without. With energy prices rising again from October, about 10%, the government must act to help people fearing another difficult winter. At the same time that report was published, the government approved a last-minute extension to an under-threat £1 billion crisis fund available to English councils to provide emergency help for millions of low-income households. Had that not happened, and this is really, really extraordinary, 1/3 of English councils would no longer have the means to provide local crisis support. In response, Liz Kendall, the Work and Pensions Secretary, said this: "We are extending the Household Support Fund for the next 6 months because it is a lifeline for people who are struggling with the cost of living. The dire inheritance we face means more people are living in poverty now than 14 years ago. And this government is taking immediate action to prevent a cliff edge of support for the most vulnerable in our society." It's a welcome short-term measure, certainly. But given the Trussell Trust report says many expect things to get worse, and Kendall's own admission is that we've had a massive deterioration over the last 14 years, it's clearly inadequate. We have a welfare system where millions of households that are in work simply can't make ends meet. They can't even have enough food at the end of the month. There's millions more, of course, who aren't in work or can't work, but the point of the Trussell Trust and what it's raising here is that the issue among working households is politically significant. After all, how legitimate is your political system if millions of people work and don't just remain poor, but have to use loans and credit cards to feed themselves? What does any sensible person think that the end game is? Now, at the same time as all of that, the Chancellor, Rachel Reeves, has promised to produce a, quote, tax roadmap for business in next month's budget. That includes Labour's promise to cap corporation tax at 25% for the rest of the Parliament. Today, Reeves has hinted at that plan, with the current full expensing system of capital allowances also staying for the rest of the Parliament. So while other tax rises could be in the pipes, like capital gains, hopefully, corporation tax will stay where it is, which means the UK has a lower rate of corporation tax, which is a tax on corporate profits, than the likes of Germany, Japan, and California. Now, you might say it shouldn't go up in the name of stability, particularly given capital gains is probably going to go up. But it certainly makes you think about priorities. Cuts to the winter fuel allowance and millions of working families struggling to provide enough food to eat. That's not a big deal. It's not so important. But stability on corporation tax for large multinational businesses, many of which, by the way, avoid paying 25% as it is, all hands on deck. We need to reassure these people. Moya, what's the best approach here? You know, that figure about the emergency sort of crisis budget that's available to local councils, the idea that just 1 billion is enough to help 1/3 of English councils help citizens from falling into complete penury. Just 1 billion can do that. Really extraordinary. It really does make you think about what do we need to effectively get rid of in-work poverty in this country? That's another question. What do you think in regards to Labour and what they're doing here on welfare reform? Because on the one hand, they're implicitly saying, hold on, we're probably going to overhaul the system. It's going to take a couple of years. But of course, there are other people saying, well, in the meantime, you need to get rid of the two-child benefit cap. You should increase universal credit. Where do you stand on that debate?
Well, I don't think it's a different question. I think they're the same question, because I think the massive centralization of the state over the last 20, 30, whatever years, the pulling back of power into the state, and particularly the treasury, is one of the reasons that people live in such poverty. I'm reading Sam Friedman's brilliant book at the moment, which is Failed State, and he talks a lot about how the role of local councils has been so diminished, not just in terms of finances, but also in what they can actually do without say-so from the state. So in terms of, they've basically become just pots that have to fund adult social care, and they can't do any other duties. And there's been, especially in the Tory era of the last 14 years, there was this pulling back. So local councils can't do things like, organise bin collections without getting sign-off from central government, and their budgets have been massively slashed. Whereas the people who are best placed to help alleviate poverty within local areas are the councils. Of course, they would need a massive uplift in, I think, people working for them and, talent. Pull some of the people from the Treasury who are holding all the budgets and you claim to be some of the smartest civil servants in the country, stick them in the councils to work with people who actually know what's going on. That would be an effective team, in my opinion. But if you actually devolved those powers back to local councils, gave them a say-so over where funding could actually go, instead of them having to apply to, stupid little grant funds constantly. Sam Friedman writes about this excellently. There's grant funds even for getting rid of chewing gum. That's how little council have control over their own budgets and the ability to say where they go. Then I think in-work poverty could be massively alleviated, because who needs money and where that money goes does differ depending on the region you're in. But local councils are the first point of contact that these constituents have. They're the people who are most likely to be able to put those funds in the places they're most needed. Is it that, that people need funding to cook? They could have access to fresh fruit and veg if they just had the money. So is it that we need to fund that? Is it that we need to fund, more education classes for people to learn how to cook? Is it that we need to fund, places where people can get warm winter clothes, etc.? There's all different types of people suffering poverty. Both, I think, energy poverty and food poverty are the two things that lead to the most immiseration at the moment. But give some power and funding back to local councils in the short term. That would massively change the landscape of poverty in this country and in-work poverty in this country. You need to decentralise. Labour have made big noises about devolving powers, but we've not seen it yet. We've seen them talking about banning smoking in pub gardens, but they're yet to unveil the plans. And I don't want to rush them, because one of the problems with the government is that we have constant short-term ripping up of what has gone before and trying to reinvent the wheel, and you've only got 4 years and nothing, and then everyone gets more and more and more disillusioned that anything will change. They need long-term strategic units back. They need these long-term plans back. They could start with local councils. They could start by actually pulling the money out, giving it to local councils from those, if they did like a capital gains tax or whatever. Also changing the taxation system with local councils, changing things like council tax. It's even, if we live in a massively mad rental market now. So why are people paying council tax for their landlords in properties they will never have a chance of owning? And yeah, sure, it's based on a valuation from 1991, but why are they paying that tax? Especially if they're in poverty. I've got no idea how that is allowed. So there's all kinds of things, but I think it starts with local councils. Your question was totally on point. It wasn't a tangent at all.
I'm glad to hear that. And your answer about local councils is so spot on. We've had, really since 2010, you've seen the central grant that's given to local government. So money from Westminster going to local councils, it's been reduced by about 50%. Some places it's slightly more, some places it's slightly less. And as you've said, Moya, that I think actually the first thing Labour should have done when they came back into office is to rectify that. That's the very first thing you should do, because people's everyday experience of the deterioration of this country, whether it's adult social care, whether it's the high street, whether it's basic cleanliness, all kinds of things relate to local government. And that has been absolutely destroyed by Westminster since 2010, particularly by the Tories. And it really does frustrate me when you get people on the right saying, austerity never happened. Well, if you're going to cut funding to local government by 50%, that kind of feels to lots of people like austerity. Moya, thanks for joining me this evening.
Thank you so much for having me. I got to talk about my favourite things, which is local councils. And I know you share this passion too. So I'm glad that we got to do it today.
I am too. Moya's got a new beat for people who aren't aware. And I think you're going to produce great work in Glasgow. I think it's a really exciting time actually for local journalism. Not something that Novara does, so I'm not got a vested interest in saying that. But there's so many great stories out there happening outside of London. And of course, we want to be a part of telling those as well here at Novara Media. And thanks everyone for watching this evening. Come back tomorrow for another show from 6 p.m. You've been watching Novara Media. Good night.